Guys, is all about light. So what are we going to be looking at tonight? So in this lesson we're going to be looking at the fundamentals of how the camera works. Most people learn photography in reverse and spend a long time getting their head around extremely technical subjects to only then learn later on that the camera works. Actually the camera is a really incredibly simple device and haven't really changed a huge amount since their invention. So we will see by the end of this lesson that these highly complex devices are much simpler than you imagined. We're also going to be talking about that key term exposure and looking at exposure and understanding that when we're trying to capture light to make a picture, we need to control it in order to capture images the way we want to see them. So we're going to be looking at that in great detail. And why do we want to know about the camera and how it works? Well, if we have a lack of understanding of how the camera works, and we really do have a lack of understanding of the fundamentals of photography in terms of we have this tool, this device that we use to capture light. And light is really the main ingredient in a photographic image. It's the key component to making a photograph. And every time you take a picture, you're working with light. And the camera captures and records that for us. So again, like any other craft or skill, if you don't know the tools you're working with, then you're not I suppose knowledgeable in that subject that you work within, or you're missing some core knowledge or core information on that subject. So again, this would be similar to maybe a carpenter who didn't know that much about timber or wood, right? So if a carpenter doesn't know that much about timber or wood, he's not going to be a very good carpenter, right? So as photographers, we need to know about firstly our tools and also about light and how light works. So having this kind of skill gives you a better ability to utilize the camera. Without it, we do have an inability to capture and record light accurately and as intended. So we're not able to really capture and manipulate light the way we want to if we don't have an understanding of it. And again, understanding the camera is really essential to troubleshooting and solving problems when you do have bad exposures and issues with lighting and different things like that. So it's all really important information. Again, learning about exposure, why is that important to us? Well, poorly lit images, obviously aren't very attractive. So they're not very attractive to the viewer, they're not very attractive to us, and they don't represent our skill level very well. We'll get inconsistent results when we're out shooting, and we'll spend so much time in front of the computer in post-production trying to correct images and trying to fix problems. I'm a firm believer in learning the camera inside out first so that you can capture the best images possible, so that you just spend less time sitting in front of your computer trying to fix problems and more time getting creative, getting outdoors, spending time actually shooting, doing what you love to do. And then if you're going to sit in front of the computer and edit your images, that you're doing a creative thing, you're doing a positive thing, not going backwards and fixing problems. I prefer to be shooting, getting good images in camera, and then using post-production as a creative tool. Again, lack of creative control if we don't understand how to capture light properly or learn how to use exposure properly. And again, that just means that we won't have the ability to capture scene the way we want it. We won't get the full creative elements that we want from an image. And also an inability to relax and be creative. Guys, learning technical stuff in photography is really, really important, because the more technical stuff you know, the less you actually have to think about when you're out shooting. So when you go out and shoot, you could actually relax and make images that are creative and interesting, and you can have a lot more fun because you're not trying to get your exposures right. You're not messing around with settings trying to figure out how do I just capture the scene. So the more technical stuff you've got, the better your images are going to be, and the more relaxed and more enjoyable photography will be, because you're not thinking all the time about the creative stuff, or about the technical stuff, sorry. So in this lesson, guys, and before we go into that, just a reminder about lesson 2. In lesson 2, we looked at how the view of the camera's lens directly correlates with our view, or our angle of view. So tonight we're going to be talking about how the camera sees and records images. But what we'll see is that the camera works very similar to our eyes, and the process of controlling exposure is almost the same as our eyes. So to understand how the camera works and how exposure works, we're first going to look at how our eyes work, or how we see. So I use the phrase a lot, the camera captures light, Or when we talked about the DSLR, I kept saying that light enters the lens and things like that. The reason I say this is because light makes our pictures, and light is what allows us to see the world around us as well. So how does light allow us to see? So, on Earth here, obviously where we are, the primary source of light comes from the sun. Otherwise, we have artificial light that provides a source of light for us when we're obviously indoors or whatever. So like the ceiling lights in your room. If you're outdoors, it's natural light from the sun. If you're indoors, it is artificial light. Most objects in the world do not emit light. They do not have their own natural light source, okay? So if you look around your room at home, or even just look at your hands or your clothes, they don't have a light source. They're not emitting light. The way that light allows us to see is that all objects actually reflect light. Even the blackest and the darkest objects on the planet reflect some amount of light, therefore allowing us to see them. So what actually happens is that light from the sun, or from your artificial light source, is emitting light. So the light is obviously emitting sunlight all the time. It's bouncing off and reflecting off all the objects around us, then enters our eyes, allowing us to see. So again, just look at your hands or some object around you. Light from your room right now, or maybe your computer screen, is bouncing off your hands or bouncing off your clothes or the objects around you and entering your eyes. And that's what allows us to see them. This is what allows us to see. Okay, so it's light that's bouncing back off everything. Okay, and this is the case for almost everything in the actual universe. And not to go into too much science about it, or too much of the science side, but the only object that actually doesn't emit light in the universe is a black hole in space, which, now as I said, I won't go into the science too much behind this, but it absorbs all of the light that hits it and doesn't allow any of it back out. And as it doesn't reflect light, it's actually invisible to us. So if something doesn't reflect light, it's actually invisible to us. So what we call something that doesn't emit any light has 0% luminosity. Okay. However, all objects have some luminosity above zero and reflect light, again allowing us to see. Now you might be wondering, why am I going into this in so much detail? Well, this is important to get your head around, this idea of light making our photographs, because light is what produces the images that we see or the photographs that we capture. Again, you will always hear the word light used in reference to photography, and it works the same way for our camera as it does for our eyes, except that our camera wants to record and capture light. That's the main difference. We want to record it and capture it. Light is one of the most fundamental elements to our vision and then also to our photography. So, human vision. So now that we understand how light allows us to see, let's take it a little bit further and look at how our eyes control light so that we can see in different situations. I like to think of light similar to water, like there's a constant flow of it coming into our eyes, and that we can control the flow of light, just like we can control the flow of water from a tap. We can turn it up and down. If you even understand this on a basic level about how your eyes see and how they control light, you'll really grasp how the camera works. And as I said at the beginning of the lesson, you'll understand how simple a camera really is. This is the kind of knowledge that photographers can actually go years and years without understanding, and it's so fundamental to simplifying and understanding how these complex devices that we use every day are. So understanding how we see and how your eyes control light will really help you also understand exposure and why pictures are too bright or too dark. To really understand how the camera captures and controls light, you need to understand what's called exposure theory. Eventually, you will understand this to the point that you'll be able to make the decisions about how much light the camera is capturing, and you'll have full control. And we'll be looking at this as the course progresses. And by lesson 8, you'll be thinking about how much light is in the scene and how do I capture that and control it myself, and not be letting the camera make all the decisions for you. So just as we've seen, light is reflected from all objects around us. It enters our eyes and allows us to see. Right, we got that so far. But what about different lighting conditions and extremes of lighting condition? Why can we see on a really, really bright summer's day, but also in a dark room, only lit by maybe a candle or a lamp? Remember, as I mentioned, that I like to think about light like water flowing from a tap. I imagine a constant flow of light entering our eyes, and like a tap, that flow can be controlled. It can be turned up and down. So in different lighting conditions, our eyes have the ability to control the flow of light entering them and to deal with various different lighting conditions we might be in. So what lets our eyes control the flow of light coming into them? Because if it's a very, very bright day, there's going to be a lot of light. But if we're in a dark room, there's going to be very little light. Our eyes have a pupil, okay? So I'll just show you there, guys. And that can be opened and closed, or essentially made bigger or smaller to restrict the flow of light or to allow more light in, depending on the lighting conditions we are in. Too much light, and we'll be blinded by the objects. We won't be able to, they'll be too bright, we won't see them correctly. Too little light, and the objects will be too dark, and we won't be able to actually see them properly either. So this is essentially exposure, this concept of too bright or too dark. Our eyes need a certain pupil size or a setting in order for our vision to be correctly exposed for the scene that we're looking at. Too much light and our vision is overexposed. Too little light and it will be underexposed. So when you're in a dark room, the pupil in our eyes opens up wide to allow as much light as possible in so that we can see the environment around us or see as much of it as possible. You may notice that when you initially walk into a dark room or go outside at night, that you cannot see a whole lot at first, but after a few seconds, and especially after a few minutes, you can actually see much more of the environment around you. So in the opposite situation, say outdoors on a sunny day, or just in a bright situation, our pupil actually closes down to restrict the light flow that coming into our eyes. And that's so that we're not blinded by the light and we can actually see everything around us normally. So you can see from the picture on the right just how small the pupil can actually get. So do we kind of understand that in a situation where there's very little light, that pupil opens up big and wide and gets much more light in, right? Does that make sense? And then when we're in a dark situation, that pupil closes right down to control or restrict the flow of light. So this is all to keep our vision exposed correctly. So we're seeing objects correctly. We're not seeing things, we're not seeing in total darkness, and we're not seeing things too bright that they're actually blinding us. Okay, so as you can see in this illustration, when the pupil is undilated or at its smallest, a very small or restricted flow of light is coming in. This would be the setting our eyes would be using for a bright condition so that our vision isn't overexposed or so that we can actually see normally. Okay, and in this particular image on the right, our pupil is dilated, it's open at its widest. So as you can see, there is much more light being allowed to pass through. In this case, you'd probably be in a dark situation and our eyes would be trying to allow as much light as possible in so that we can see more of the environment. So you can kind of see from that illustration how the flow of light gets bigger as the eye or as the pupil opens up. I always like to think of the pupil as having a setting for different lighting conditions, as it links directly back to how the camera works. Our brain knows when we need different settings to control the amount of light coming into our eyes and controls this flow by making adjustments to the pupil. So our brain does the work for us. It opens and closes that pupil so that we're either restricting light or allowing more light in. This is a really good way, guys, of thinking about light because it works. The camera itself works the same way. The camera's brain or processor knows when there's too much light or too little light coming in and tells the things like the shutter or the aperture in the camera to restrict the flow of light so that it can capture the right amount of light for you. Now when I say the camera makes adjustments, that's in an automatic mode or a semi-automatic mode. Eventually we will want to be the ones making the decisions and controlling the flow of light ourselves. We want to be doing that ourselves. We don't want the camera making these decisions. For now, if you don't know what shutter and aperture are, don't worry, that is the subject of next week's lesson. But just for now, understand the camera makes the adjustments to get that flow of light right for you so that your exposures are correct. So before we go on and we look at how exposure works in relation to our photography and the images that we capture, I want to start to make that connection between our eyes and the camera and how the camera works. This will hopefully change the way you think about the complexity of a camera. So we're going to start to bring this together. The word photography itself comes from the Greek word photos, meaning light, and grapheme meaning drawing, and put together means drawing or painting with light. And this is what we do. We use light to capture and create images that we take. I want to talk a little bit about the history of the camera for a second, as it's important to understand how this device came about. I won't go into a huge amount of detail, guys, on the history of photography, as it's really not part of the course, and really it would be a course in itself anyway. However, I'll recommend a great book at the end of this section for anyone who really wants to learn more about the history of photography. So what is this camera? What is this mysterious device that we use every day? Most people will actually say that photography started somewhere between the years 1827 and 1839. Now, this is true. However, this is really only the point where they finally were able to capture and record pictures. In actual fact, the concept of photography has been around for about 2,500 years, all the way back to 400 BC, when a Chinese philosopher called Mu Ti mentioned the basic concept of light forming images. Now, of course, at this point, they didn't know it was photography, and they weren't thinking about it that way, but he made the connection between light forming images, and that's what's really important. What they did realize was that when sitting in a dark room, that light entering the room through a tiny hole would actually form a picture on the wall opposite the room. I'll show you a diagram of this in a second. Over the next 1,000 years, this led to the development of what was called the camera obscura. The camera obscura is a darkened room with a pinhole in one wall. And because of the physics of light, light passing through the tiny hole projects the scene from outside on the opposite wall inside the room. Again, because of the physics of how light moves, the picture would actually be upside down and back to front. But back in those days, they had no way of recording the image. So you can see from the diagram, what's happening here is you've got a room that's completely dark, completely black, except for that one hole in the wall. And that's allowing light to pass through. And light will pass through and actually form an image on the back wall. And back in those days, they had no way of recording the image. So what they did was, so a painter or an artist would sit in the room and sketch or paint over the image that was being projected onto the wall. Eventually, over the next 700 to 800 years, the desire to capture or to record this image without a painter or scientist became really the desire of scientists and inventors. So they really got interested, and to find a way of capturing this image without having to paint or draw over it. So if you've never heard of the term camera obscura, it is just a darkened room with a pinhole in it. Okay, so a hole in the front, and the light from outside coming through the hole projects an image of whatever is outside the room on the wall on the opposite side of the room. Okay, so that's where the image is projected. However, when this was first used, they couldn't record or capture the image in any other way, only to draw or paint over it. Just another illustration of that, you can see the person is standing outside the room, she's being projected into the room, and she's actually upside down and back to front, and this guy is sitting here sketching over it. It's a really, really interesting subject. Okay, so as the centuries passed, the camera obscura became smaller and much more portable, so the artists could move around. Lenses were added then eventually to help focus the image and make it sharper. In this style of camera obscura, a mirror was actually added so that the image was redirected upwards onto this glass surface so the artist could then sketch or paint over it. So you can see actually the light's coming through the lens, hitting the mirror and being projected up onto another piece of glass or a glass screen, and the artist could actually sketch or paint over it. So you can see in this picture, as I said, the light is entering the lens, it's hitting the mirror, and it's being projected onto a screen. This is very similar to the concept of a DSLR camera. Light coming in through the lens, hitting a mirror, and being projected onto a surface. The main difference here is that at this point, there's still no way of recording that image. Okay, so in 1827, a French inventor, Joseph Niepce, captured an image on what was called a bitumen-coated metal plate using a camera obscura to produce the first photographic image he called a heliograph. So essentially, he came up with a light-sensitive metal plate that actually could record the image being projected from the camera obscura. This image here is actually the first image ever recorded and made permanent. So it's a really, really important image in the history of photography. You can see the image is very difficult to make out. It's not very clear. But at this point, they weren't too interested in capturing a nice picture, rather the process of permanently recording an image without having to paint or draw or any other traditional process. So that was really when photography was born. In 1838 then, Louis Daguerre, who previously worked with Niepce, revealed his own superior process to the world. His recorded images were incredibly high quality, and the photography was really officially born in this year. A little side note on this image: if you actually look into the bottom left corner, just slightly above the bottom left corner, you'll actually see a guy getting his boots shined. And back in those days, the exposure was so long that the only person recorded in the scene was that one guy, because he was standing there so long. And we'll talk about that later on in a different lesson about slow shutter speeds. But this guy here is officially the first person ever photographed. So it's an interesting little note on that image. It's the first image ever captured with a person in it. Okay, and then around the same year, a British inventor working completely independently from Daguerre had also came up with his own process, which he called the Caliotype. And there was a lot of controversy in politics around the two different processes at the time and their patents, the different patents that they were applying for. And then eventually Daguerre's process, called the daguerreotype, eventually became the preferred method. So there was a lot of issues all around the world at the same time. Everyone was trying to come up with a process to record images and thinking completely independent of each other. But in terms of there was a lot of politics, a lot of different issues over patents, and the daguerreotype really took center stage. So this is extremely brief history, guys, in photography, but I just wanted to give you a sense of when light was first recorded and captured. The concept of the camera has been around for almost 2,500 years. However, it's actually being able to record the image and make it permanent is barely 180 years old. Again, though, over that 180 years, the camera itself and the process for recording light have really not changed a whole lot. So for anyone who's still interested in learning a little bit more about the history of photography, I'm just going to show you a book which is a fantastic source. Okay, and one of my favorite books personally. It's called A New History in Photography. And it's a fantastic book, huge big book, and does have an extensive history in photography. Okay, so just to go back to the camera obscura for a minute, all that really developed over those 2,500 years was that eventually they found a way to record and capture images that formed inside the camera obscura. So instead of the painter, the guy inside tracing the image, a glass or metal plate covered with different chemicals made the plate light sensitive and allowed it to record or capture the image. As photography developed, the size of the box got smaller, or the camera obscura, and eventually a light-sensitive film replaced the glass or metal plates. And then, in recent years, a light-sensitive sensor replaced film. So not a huge amount has happened. The main difference between the camera obscura and a regular camera that records an image is that there is some sort of light-sensitive recording surface inside that captures the image. This could be a piece of film or a digital sensor. Not a huge amount has changed. On a piece of film or digital sensor, when the surface is exposed to light, an image starts to build up. The more light that we have, the faster the image starts to form. If at some point the light is not stopped or blocked, the image will become overexposed and get too bright. If you cut off the light too soon, then the picture will not get enough of light to form properly, and we have a dark image. So in order to record pictures, the camera obscura was equipped with two mechanisms for controlling the amount of light and the length of time that light was hitting the light-sensitive material. Those two mechanisms are the camera's aperture and its shutter. We'll be looking at these in much more detail in Lesson 4. Going back to our discussion on the eye, the aperture is designed just like the pupil in your eye. It's a small hole that can be opened and closed to change the flow of light coming into the camera, which is just like the pupil in your eye. The larger the aperture, the more light that's coming in. And just like the pupil, if the aperture is made smaller, the less light is coming in. Okay, so looking at the hole in the camera obscura, the aperture just allows you to control the size of that hole. So if this is how the camera, so this is really, guys, how the camera controls the flow of light or the volume of light coming in. As the surface that records the light is light sensitive, as I mentioned, you need to be able to stop the light at a certain point, and that is what the shutter does. It blocks the light sensitive surface from receiving any more light so that the picture doesn't become overexposed. Okay, so at some point we need to cut that light off, and that is what the shutter does. So on the most basic level, the shutter simply just stops any more light entering the camera. So aperture controls the volume of light coming in, guys, and the shutter stops that light when we have enough. So it controls how long or the duration. The camera itself has just gotten smaller and smaller, but still operates exactly the same way. It's just a darkened box with a small hole in that controls the flow of light, which is the aperture inside your lens, and a means or a way of stopping that light, which is the shutter, when you have enough light to record the image correctly. The picture is recorded at the back of the camera on a piece of film, or in most cases now a digital sensor. So a camera is as simple as that: an aperture, shutter, and something to record the image on, which in our case usually is a digital sensor now. Those are the three components that a camera needs to operate and make pictures. When you set your camera to automatic, all the camera does is make different combinations of shutter and aperture to capture images for you. All those different automatic settings we looked at in lesson 2 are just combinations of shutter and aperture. Eventually, you will be the ones making those combinations in fully manual mode. For anyone who's unfamiliar with film photography, here's a quick example of a roll of film and another picture of one actually inside the camera. And as I said, the concept is simply the same. Light passes through the camera's lens, records on the scene on the piece of film. The shutter inside the camera just stops the flow of light when we've had enough of light. So that's a piece of film inside an old film camera. Most of your cameras probably now are digital, so same principles apply. Today, film has almost been totally replaced by a light-sensitive digital sensor. As you can see from the second image, that the sensor sits in the back of the camera body, and light is coming through and it records it. Same principle applies. The shutter just stops the light when you have enough, and the aperture controls the volume of light. We will be looking at the other side effects, or the other effects that shutter and aperture have on your actual pictures, but for now we're just thinking in terms of how it controls light. Just to give you a bit more information, here's an example of what a camera obscura looks like inside a room. This is something anybody can do. And from our previous courses, people love to get out doing this. It's such an interesting thing to do. You can make your own room completely dark with no light coming in at all. So this means blocking up the window completely. You can then make a pinhole to allow a tiny amount of light to come in, and what you will get is an image forming inside your room of the world outside, or the image outside. This is something anybody could do. Again, the picture, because the optics are the physics of light, the image will be upside down and back to front, but it's such an amazing effect. The size of the pinhole really depends on how much light is outside, so you may need to experiment with the size of the actual hole you make in whatever you're using to block up your windows. But this is a lot of fun to try, guys. It's so much fun. What you do is just block up your room completely until there's no light. A small room is always better because you have less windows to block up. And then start to play around with making a tiny hole. And what you're going to get is light coming into your room and forming a picture on the wall. It's a really cool thing to try out, guys. Another fun and interesting thing to try is pinhole photography itself. As I mentioned, a camera is just a box with a hole in it. And so you can actually make a camera out of anything, really. Most people make them out of shoe boxes, coffee cans. You can really make them out of anything. I've even seen cameras made out of cigarette boxes, or people have actually made cameras out of their own mouth, believe it or not, where you just open and close your mouth really quickly and let light in. Interesting stuff. Now, there are loads and loads of websites and YouTube videos showing how to do this. in order to actually record the image, you usually do need a light-sensitive film or paper inside the camera. So in this kind of a camera here, all you do is put a bit of light-sensitive paper or film in the back. You make a small hole, you open and close, you make a little makeshift shutter. It could be out of tape or metal or anything, and you open and close it very quickly. Timing is something you have to learn a little bit about in terms of how much time. It's something you just need to experiment with. The only difference, or the only difficult part of this is actually knowing how much time to give it, and also then actually getting the film developed. So you would need to bring the film somewhere to get developed. But the images are so interesting from a pinhole camera. You can actually buy kits as well, guys. Go on Amazon and eBay and different things. You can buy kits to allow you to make pinhole cameras. It's so much fun. Pinhole usually comes with lots and lots of distortion because the lens there's no lens essentially, and they produce a huge amount of distortion and really strange perspectives and heavy vignetting. But it's just part of the look, it's part of the aesthetic of pinhole, and lots and lots of fun to play around with, guys. Okay, let's talk about exposure then. Okay, so exposure really refers to capturing the scene as you see it, getting just the right amount of light into the camera and not too much light or not too little light, okay? Every scene will have its own particular exposure. And in lesson 7, we'll be looking at ways of measuring the amount of light, or measuring this light, and understanding when enough light has been captured. For now, we're simply going to look at the concept of exposure in more detail. The 3 main terms you usually need to worry about with exposure are overexposure, underexposure, and correct exposure. Okay, where we have the right amount of light for the scene. So correct exposure. We're going to talk about these in a bit more detail. So here we have an image that's overexposed. On the most basic level, the picture has simply got too much light, or it's simply too bright. This also makes the colors kind of washed out and look abnormal. And so this image has had too much light and resulted in an image obviously looks like that. So if we all shot an overexposed image at some point, I think we all have, and we probably still all do every day, but understanding that it's just simply when you have too much light. We'll also have other issues like detail will become overexposed, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. Just to get the basic concept down, here we have an underexposed version of the same image. As you can see, the grass is very dark, very dull, and the image just generally has an overall sense of being too dark. There's a huge amount of detail is also too dark. It's, that we can't see the detail properly. As I said, it just doesn't really represent the scene the way we want to see it. So in this particular situation, we just had too little light coming in, or we hadn't had enough light, or the light coming in for long enough, and we resulted in a picture that's just simply too dark. So this is the correctly exposed version of the image. And when I say correctly exposed, I mean the image looks the way that the scene looked at the time. So this image was captured on a nice bright sunny day with a nice blue sky. So when I captured this particular picture, I wanted to show this. I wanted to actually capture and represent the scene the way I wanted. So for this scene, the objective was to show the blue sky and the nice vivid green grass. So as I mentioned, already, correct exposure refers to capturing the scene the way you want it, or the way that you want it to be seen. Now, that is subjective. Exposure can be subjective, meaning that you can also decide what you consider to be a correct exposure, because sometimes you may want the scene to look a little bit brighter or a little bit darker than it is on front of you, than the scene actually is right there and then. This may be because an image looks more dramatic darker, or helps to capture the mood or the atmosphere of a scene better. So you can also decide yourselves what correct exposure is. So it doesn't always mean capturing the image exactly as it is. Correct exposure can be totally subjective. You may decide that this picture works way better darker, and that's what you want, and that might be your correct exposure. But just for now, in terms of talking about it as a subject, we're going to talk about correct exposure as capturing the scene as it looked at the time, or at the level of light that was there at the time. Okay, so let's look at an exposure building up, and the differences between the point when it's correctly exposed and overexposed. So here we have a white object on a white background. As the image the image is currently underexposed. The whites appear very grey, the image looks very flat and dull. It doesn't represent the scene correctly as a bright white object on a white background. Just one note, guys. We all have different computer screens. We all have different, whether we're working on a desktop or a laptop or whatever. If you're not seeing these pictures as underexposed, this one is quite grey and flat and dull looking, it's possible that your screen is brightened up too high. Color management or screen brightness is a very difficult subject in photography because we all have screens. They can be brightened up to the maximum and then they show images a lot brighter than they actually are. So if any of you guys are seeing these images as maybe this one as a bright white, for example, your screen is probably up too bright. Here in our office we have a color managed environment. We have a calibrated screen, which means that we see images at the right level of brightness so we can actually judge them accurately. It is a problem in photography. It's a little bit beyond the course we're doing right now. It's a bit of an advanced subject. But screen brightness plays basically a huge role in how you see the picture. So when you put a picture on screen, if your screen is really bright, it's going to look a lot brighter, and it is a bit of an issue. But for now, we'll just hope for the best that all your screens are showing a pretty good representation of this image. So, as I said, here we've an underexposed image, which is kind of grey and flat looking. So, if we were to allow a little bit more light in during the exposure of this scene, the overall image would get slightly brighter, and the whites would start to get closer to white. I would still say at this point that it's maybe a little bit too grey and doesn't represent the objects or the scene correctly. So, if we give it even a little bit more light, now the image is starting to get very close to what it should resemble. And the whites are no longer grey or flat looking. We can still see all the detail in the subject, and it's much more appealing to look at. At this point, we would make a decision as to whether to take the picture even further with a little bit more light to see if it improves it, or maybe we'll end up overexposing it. Okay, so here's another version of the image that is again slightly more light. At this point the image is probably getting a bit too bright as the whites are now starting to blend together. So the whites of the object in the background are starting to blend. At this point we're starting to lose what's called separation between the subject and the background. This just means that we're starting to lose definition between the shape of the subject and the background it's photographed against. But this slight difference, again, is something you can decide whether it makes the picture better or whether it's, starting to overexpose, and it's a decision you would make while shooting. Just to take it that little bit further again, we'll overexpose it even slightly more. You can see now it's starting to completely blend with the background, and we're losing all definition in the shape of the subject. The details and textures have started to become pure white, which means we're completely losing detail in these areas. Well, I'll look at the importance of highlight detail in a few minutes with the aid of some examples, so don't worry about that. We'll talk about highlight detail in a few minutes. When you overexpose an image too much, your highlights, which are the brightest parts of your image, will eventually become pure white with no detail, and we'll see that in a few minutes. So just to look at the opposite end of a scale. Here we have a black object against a black background. Now, as an exposure, it's actually not that bad. We can see that the detail of the camera, we can see the texture of the surface it's sitting on. However, remember that exposure is all about trying to capture the scene as you see it. And this is a black object on a black background. I would expect to see the blacks are much deeper and closer to a black tone. At the moment, I think they're a little bit bright and a little bit grey. So if we were to underexpose this image or allow less light into this scene, you can see now that the background looks a lot blacker, and so does the camera itself. We can still see all the detail, texture, shape of the camera itself. So I would be happy that it's not too underexposed, it's not too dark. Any deeper or darker, it might get to the point where we can no longer see definition in the object. like the white picture we've just saw, we'll probably start to blend the background and the camera together if we go any darker. So at this point I'd be happy the blacks are blacks, we can still see texture and detail in the camera and the surface it's sitting on, and that's just by restricting a little bit light. So we underexpose the image more than the one before. So that was a before, this is a little bit more underexposed or a little bit less light. If we allowed it even less light, you can see here now that the image is the subject and the background is starting to blend together. There's no separation between the camera and the background is sitting on. If we were to enlarge this image, you'd actually probably notice that most of the detail of the camera and the surface have become pure black. So when you underexpose an image too much, the blacks or the darker areas in your image will become pure black, which means all the detail is lost. Again, we'll be looking at the importance of shadow detail in a couple of slides now. Okay, so exposure for shadows and highlights. To give you a better understanding of why maintaining detail in your image is important, we're going to look at an image that is correctly exposed and see how an underexposed and an overexposed, overexposing and underexposing would affect its highlights, so the brightest parts of its image, and the shadows, the darkest parts of the image. Over and underexposure affects the entire image, but as we'll see here, it has greater effect on the shadows and highlights, as they can be affected by even slight adjustments to exposure in either direction. So what we're going to do first is look at correct exposure and we'll look at highlight detail. So to make this more visual, I'm going to take a section of this image that is and show you the brightest highlights of this picture. Okay, so this area here, we're going to enlarge this and have a look at the highlights in this area. So here I've enlarged this section for you so you can see the detail in this area. So I've just taken that sky and enlarged it. As you can see, the sky and clouds have lots of detail. All the different shades and tones give the clouds kind of depth, shape and texture. Having this depth, shape and texture is what makes the sky look so dramatic in the overall image. So this section here is from what we would call, or what we would consider the correctly exposed version of the image. And I would like to maintain this detail in the image when photographing this scene. So, and as I said, the importance of this kind of detail is to create that depth and texture and shape to an image. We will see what a slightly exposed version of the image would look like in the next slide. Okay, so here is a slightly overexposed version of the image. It's not dramatically overexposed, just slightly, and may not seem to affect the image too badly. However, when I show you another enlarged proportion of this particular image, you'll see how the overexposed exposure is affecting the highlight detail. So as an image overall, you're probably thinking, yeah, it's not too bad. It's actually quite a good image still. But when we start to dig into the highlight detail, you'll see the difference in the two images. Okay, so this is a section here, guys, that I'm going to enlarge for you. Again, it's the same section. I just want to show you how overexposure affects the highlight details. So here's the section taken from the overexposed version. And what's happened here is that the highlights have gotten much brighter, or even like a little bit brighter, and now they've gotten to the point where some of them have become pure white. Anytime you have a pure white in your image, the detail in that area becomes lost. There's no detail there. Here we have now lost all of the detail and texture in a big area of the clouds. So this area here, guys. Okay, this has become pure white, so we're losing that shape and texture and tone in that area. This also causes some issues later for printing, as we'll discuss later on. I'll stick up the two now so that you can compare. Okay, so here we have the correctly exposed version and we have the overexposed version. Can we see that area in terms of how it starts to lose its depth and its shape, and how that affects the overall that overall area? Brilliant. So it's starting to make sense, guys, in terms of overexposure in the entire image and overexposure in the highlights. So it is affecting the image overall, but it's particularly affecting your highlights or your brightest whites. Okay, guys, so what we're going to look at now is the shadow, okay, so the shadow end and how underexposure affects your shadow detail. So what we're going to do again is look at the shadow details first in a correctly exposed version of the image, and then we're going to again look at the underexposed version. So here we have the original image again, or the correctly exposed version. In this image, the shadow details, we have shadow detail in the dark rocks and in any shadow area really around the image. So shadow detail it refers to anything that's really dark within your image and how much detail is contained within that area. Again, I'm going to enlarge a section of this image for you. So this particular area here, because it's got a lot of dark tones and shadow detail and texture and things like that. And we're going to look at the underexposed version of that. Okay. So here we have the correctly exposed version, and we're just looking at a shadow detail area, or an area with a lot of shadow detail. In the enlarged section, you can see even the darkest areas have some detail. They aren't just areas of solid black or solid mass of tones. What you're seeing is nice texture in the rock and detail and form and shape and different things like that. Again, like the highlight areas, in this kind of detail in the shadow areas, this is what gives your images depth. Again, it gives it texture and shape. It creates dimension in your images when you have shadow detail. And it's what gives your images that feeling of, as I said, dimension. It gives your images that feeling of depth. So if we look at an underexposed version of the image, again, at a glance, we might go, yeah, it's not a bad picture. It's not, visually that unappealing. We can still see the nice textures in the rocks in the foreground. The highlight details look good. But if we were to dig into the shadows again, we're going to see how underexposure has affected it. Okay, so again, I'm going to do the same thing. Now, again, this isn't dramatically underexposed. It's only slightly underexposed. And again, we'll just have a quick look at a section, that section there. We're going to pull it up larger on screen and see how underexposure has affected that particular area. Okay, so here is our underexposed version. And like I mentioned earlier, when shadow detail becomes too dark, they become pure black. And this level of black has no detail. So you see here that when this image is underexposed, even by a little, it has a dramatic effect on the shadow detail. The areas which you could see lots of detail in the last image have now become pure black. All that nice detail and texture and tone that was in the rocks is now just patches of black. Again, highlights, just like the highlights, these areas are what gave us our depth and our shape and different things like that. And as photographers, we're trying to always preserve shadow and highlight detail. We're always trying to get accurate exposures, and we're always trying to, maintain as much of the image or the detail in the image as possible. So that's usually our goal. So again, we try and avoid things like overexposed highlights where we're losing detail. We're always trying to avoid underexposed shadows so that we have always got a bit more dimension to our images. And particularly when it comes to printing, we want to print our images big. We don't want patches of pure white with no detail. It just looks wrong in an image. We don't want pure blacks making up our shadows, because then the image loses depth. So we're going to just quickly compare those two so that you have a good idea. So just to put them up side by side, the correctly exposed, there's a slight typo on that particular slide. That should say underexposed on the right. So guys, just forgive me on that one. That should say underexposed. So here we have a correctly exposed on the left and an underexposed on the right. And you can see how we've lost so much of that texture and shape and detail. So you can see that a slight underexposure can really affect those darkest areas in our image. And then obviously the more the image is underexposed, the more the overall picture will start to look darker. What I would show you guys is how exposure can play a role then in the printing process or printing stage. Another reason we will always try and preserve highlight detail is when it comes to printing our photographs. If you have areas of your image that have been overexposed to the point where they become pure white, then you will lose definition between the image itself and the paper. So if you've got pure white, the image will have no definition between the paper white and the whites in your image. The image here is printed on white paper. So the big white border that you can see And it's pretty obvious that we can see the paper white in this particular one. But if this image was any brighter, it would start to get overexposed. And what would happen is that the overexposed areas would start to blend with the white of the paper. And again, we'll make this more visual in this next slide. Okay, so here we have the same image, slightly overexposed, and the printed on a paper with the same border. And what's happened here, guys, because so many areas of the image have become pure white from being overexposed, now it's very difficult to define the edges of the image. We can't actually see an edge because the sky has gone so white it's got no detail anymore. Typically this is a no-no when it comes to printing, as it tends to look like a technical issue or technical mistake. So it's very common in skies to overexpose them to the point where then you can't see a defined area between your paper and your print. Saying that, like most things in photography, it's all subjective. If you find that this is much more creative and interesting way to print, then go for it. But as a general rule, we try and avoid having overexposed areas to the point where they're pure white, because then there is no definition between the image and the print, and you end up with no clear lines or no clear definition of your image, like the second image here on the right. If there is the highlights are too bright, if they're bright overexposed to that point, the actual image has no detail in it. And what you're seeing is that the printer has printed nothing in that area, and it's just, it has no definition. You're just seeing the paper coming through. So you're not actually seeing any printed ink, no printed detail. You're just seeing the paper coming through the image, and that really isn't a good thing from a photography point of view. Okay, this is something you may know. The same thing happens when it comes to black. You know, if you don't have, if your images are too underexposed, the printer is just going to print solid black. It's not going to print any nice detail or definition. So what you end up are with areas of solid black, and again, they don't really look that appealing in an image. Large areas of solid black just do not look good in an image because there's no definition or detail. It's just a mass of black in your image. Okay, guys, so what have we learned in tonight's lesson? Well, we've looked at the importance of light in vision and photography. We've looked at how light is captured and recorded. We've looked at the importance of understanding exposure, that concept of exposure. The importance of learning how to control exposure, and we were taking that a little bit further by bringing us into lesson 4. We've looked at the effect of exposure and what it has on highlight and shadow detail in particular. And we've looked a little bit at the effect of exposure in print. So these are the kind of key subjects we've covered tonight, guys.